This video is made possible by the free-to-play action game Crossout. Check out the game through the link in the description below, and you can start with 3 extra weapons or a vehicle cabin just for registering. More on them in a bit. In the dying days of the 20th century, a strange and terrifying plague began to carve a path through Britain. We're not talking about HIV, the virus that caused such devastation across the globe in the 80s and 90s. We're talking instead about something far more sinister, an epidemic that should never have happened. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as BSE, or by its nickname mad cow disease, first appeared on a British farm around Christmas 1984. In no time at all, it had spread first to herds across the country and then into the human food chain. The results would be catastrophic. Starting in 1996, nearly 240 people would be struck down by variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the human form of BSE. One by one, the victims' relatives were forced to watch as the plague devoured their loved ones' minds, eventually leaving only a tortured husk. Fatal in 100% of cases, its detection was a death sentence. Yet, rather than occurring naturally, this was a disease with a very human origin, one only made possible by a terrifying collision of corporate greed, government malfeasance, and sheer, callous stupidity. Today, Biographics is investigating the story of BSE, the deadly plague created by man. Although it's most associated with the 1990s, the story of BSE actually begins a long time ago, nor does it actually begin with a cow. Instead, it starts on a British farm in 1732 with one unlucky sheep. Sadly, we don't know enough about what happened to paint you a verbal picture. We can't open this section with "it was a dark and stormy night" or anything else suitably ominous, but we can say how it must have looked to the farmer. His long-forgotten sheep would have been anxious, delirious. Its head would have jittered from side to side, making it appear possessed. Before long, it would have become unsteady on its feet, started arching its back and scraping its body along stone walls, tearing out its wool. Finally, a maximum of 6 months down the line, it would have died in agony. Not long after, other sheep would have begun showing signs of the same awful disease. Known as scrapie, the blight eventually affected untold numbers of sheep, first across Britain and then across most of the rest of the world. But this being the early 18th century, people were all like, it's still food, and they ate the dead and infected sheep. And it didn't cause them any problems. To this day, there's no evidence that scrapie can jump the species barrier. Unfortunately, this would cause a major issue some 250 years down the line. When the first cattle started showing signs of BSE in the mid-1980s, it would be because of humanity's experience with scrapie that infected beef was declared safe to eat. But before we get to that part of our story, we have to make another pit stop. Cut to the 1920s. It's the era of jazz. Everyone's dressed like they're in The Great Gatsby, and a toothbrush moustache is still a legitimate fashion choice. In the shadows, though, a new disease is growing. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD, is a degenerative brain disease that's both super deadly and super rare, affecting only 1 in a million people. But what made it extra fascinating for the 1920s doctors was the way it worked. See, the surface of our brains are covered in proteins called prions. What CJD does is fold these prions in a weird way. These weird folded proteins then latch together to form toxic chains. As these chains grow, break apart, and grow again, they spread across the brain, killing cells and leaving sponge-like holes. But because the proteins are a natural part of us, our immune system doesn't identify them as something worth attacking. For someone infected with CJD, this means a steady decrease in mental functions and motor skills. There's confusion, anxiety, and difficulty walking that soon progresses into serious disability. Within a few months, you're dead, and there's no way to stop it. Since its discovery in the 1920s, CJD has been with us pretty consistently. Most years, around 350 Americans die from it. But it would be events in the 1990s that brought CJD firmly into the spotlight. The final piece of setup we need for our story today came around the same time that CJD was discovered. At some point, farmers realized they could get more profit from an animal by letting literally none of it go to waste. The grim bits like spinal cord and all the leftovers could be rendered down, mulched up, and fed back to other animals as feed. Gross as this sounds, it was a major breakthrough. Animals that consumed the shredded remains of their brethren tended to grow bigger and faster than others. By the 1980s, this barnyard cannibalism had spread across the planet, revolutionizing food production. Now it was about to cause the biggest food contamination crisis in British history. Shortly before Christmas Day 1984, David B got the call that would change his life. The local vet in his part of Sussex, B was famous among his neighbours for his pleasant singing voice. Soon, though, he'd be known for a very different reason. On a farm owned by Peter Stent, a cow was dangerously sick. What with? No one knew. When B examined it, he found the cow had unsteady legs, an arched back, and a head that was wobbling from side to side. It wasn't the first in the area to show symptoms. Just recently, one of B's veterinary friends had told him of a cow that tried to chase him on legs so weak that it had to run on its knees. But this was the first time B had seen this weird new illness up close, and he didn't like what he saw at all. The closest thing to the symptoms he could think of was mercury poisoning, but how the hell would a single cow get poisoned out on a random farm? So B kept an eye on the animal, and when it died in February 1985, he contacted the UK Central Veterinary Laboratory, the CVL. That September, the CVL examined the brain of cow 133 and found the telltale sponge-like holes of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. They named this new cattle version bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. Barely had they identified the illness, then it began cropping up everywhere. Over the next 2 years, BSE spread across the south of England. 6 positive cases were confirmed alongside 13 suspected ones. In the CVL, discussions turned to whether scrapie had jumped the species barrier from sheep to cows. There was even talk about getting more researchers involved. But the powers that be put a stop to that. A governmental memo from the time read, if the disease turned out to be bovine scrapie, it would have severe repercussions to the export trade. At present, I would recommend playing it low-key. In these 2 sentences, you can see the diseased heart of the BSE crisis. It was the 1980s. Agriculture was a huge part of Britain's economy. A health scare could cost the country billions. So officials were incentivized to keep quiet about a potential crisis. As 1987 dawned, no one said a word. They kept silent as the number of cases jumped to 46 that August, then 73, then 120. By the end of October, the first reports were appearing in the farming press about a deadly new cattle blight. But by then, it was too late. Remember how we said that farmers in the mid-20th century had started feeding unusable bits of dead animal back to their livestock? Well, they were now doing the same with BSE-infected cows. But no longer was the mulch just going to other cattle. Mechanically recovered meat is a euphemism for all the gross bits of animal that no one wants to eat. In the 1980s, someone had hit on the idea of putting it into human products. This being the Thatcher era, regulation was light. Whitehall was all like, you want to feed spinal cord to children? Sure, sounds like fun. So this mechanically recovered meat made from the most infectious parts of BSE cattle was recycled into sausages, into pies, into anything the industry could get away with. By the time the press started reporting on BSE, the ship had already sailed. Humans were eating infected meat by the millions, and nobody had any idea what would happen next. Now, just before we get into what exactly does happen next, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Crossout. Crossout is a fantastic game where you build your own vehicle and you pit yourself against other people's vehicles. Now, this isn't one of those games where it's like, yeah, you get to build a vehicle, but you just get to choose the type of ammo and maybe what sort of tires go on your craft. No, in Crossout, you get to build everything from the main structure up. You can stick on some railguns, a rocket booster, some armor, and well, with that you're ready to fight, but there's loads of other stuff you can plug on as well. If you build your craft well, you're gonna dominate. If you build it badly, well, you're probably gonna get dominated. It's a super fast-paced game with loads of different game modes, and you've got pretty much limitless freedom to create, and what you do with your vehicle is entirely up to you. Also, a major plus is that the game's not complicated right from the start. You can just jump in and get going right away without too much trouble. But there's also lots of skills to build. As you get better at the game, you really begin to understand this and build more complex things. The game grows with you. So join us on the battlefield for free, by the way. Did I mention that the game is free? PC, Xbox One, PS4, easy. And if you go through the link below, you get a free starter set with 3 extra weapons or a vehicle cabin, all as just a bonus for registering, and doing that is a great way to support what we're doing here at Biographics. And let's get back to the video. By 1988, 200 new cases of BSE were being reported every week, affecting 6,000 British farms. To the British government's credit, they did try to act. That same year, the practice of feeding animal remains to other animals was banned. The following year, the use of mechanically recovered meat in human foods was outlawed. But that was where the positive action ended. More than 1 million infected cattle were already in the human food chain. Burgers, steak, joints of roasting beef, all could be carrying this disease. The government had two choices. They either recalled the meat, told people to avoid beef, and watched the agriculture industry implode, or they just acted like nothing had happened and just hoped for the best. It was at this point that 1732 reached across the centuries to deliver the present, a devastating kick to the testicles. BSE looked like Scrapie, and since Scrapie had been around since 1732 without infecting humans, officials assumed BSE would act in exactly the same way. It was a decision based not on science, but assumption, one that would turn out to be catastrophically misjudged. Not that the public would be told this. In 1990, the Food and Agriculture Minister John Gummer began a media blitz to get Brits eating beef again. A massive full-page advert was taken out in the major papers, declaring in bold text, "Beef is safe." On TV, Gummer repeated the message, saying British beef could be eaten by adults and children without worry. At no point did he add, I guess, seriously guys, I'm just, making assumptions really, but boldly, very, very boldly.
There is no need for people to be worried, and I can say perfectly honestly that I shall go on eating beef as my children will go on eating beef because there is no need to be worried.
No, the talking point was beef is safe. Anyone who says otherwise is a science-hating Luddite. Not that science itself agreed. That same year, 1990, Dr. Stephen Dealer was conducting some worrying experiments. He had shown that, unlike Scrapie, BSE could be used to infect mice in laboratories. But when he tried to speak out, he was removed from his post and reassigned to a lowly station where he couldn't conduct further research. Meanwhile, John Gummer took a break from photo ops eating steak tartare to go on TV and accuse worried scientists of scaremongering. Looking back now, it's weird just how Soviet this all sounds. The official denials, the assumptions that politicians know better than scientists, the panicked cover-ups. In a lot of ways, you could say the BSE scandal was really the West's version of something like the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak, the accidental 1979 release of anthrax spores in Russia that killed 100 civilians. In both cases, the government pretended nothing was wrong. In both cases, nobody ever faced any kind of prosecution. But while the Sverdlovsk disaster would kill 100, BSE would kill many more. By the end of the year, the John Gummer propaganda machine was in overdrive. In one uncomfortable instance, he was photographed feeding his 4-year-old daughter a beef burger. But by now, the dangers of BSE were becoming all too apparent. That May 1990, a cat in Bristol had died from BSE after being fed infected beef. By the time the year ended, 18 more cats were dead from the disease. This wasn't another Scrapie. There was now clear evidence that BSE was not just jumping the species barrier, but leaping over it with gay abandon. 14 other species had now been infected, from household pets to animals in zoos. Everything that ate beef seemed to be coming down with this awful and fatal illness. With one major exception. As 1991 dawned, bringing with it a new prime minister, not a single case of BSE in humans had yet been recorded. But sadly, that was about to change. Near the start of the crisis in 1989, the British government had ordered the extermination of all affected cattle. However, they offered farmers only 50% compensation for each cow killed, in effect putting a heavy financial incentive in place for ignoring or misdiagnosing early signs of BSE. On top of that, the mechanically recovered meat ban of 1989 had a woeful lack of oversight. As late as November 1995, infected spinal column would still be making its way into the human food supply. All of which may go some way to explaining what would happen next. In May 1995, BSE as a national crisis seemed to be on the wane. The peak days of 1992 to 1993, when 3 cattle in every 1,000 were infected, had already passed. Then disaster struck. The first symptoms 19-year-old Steve Churchill showed were hallucinations and trouble walking. Initially, doctors diagnosed him with a psychiatric disorder. But as time went on and his condition deteriorated, it became clear that there was something badly wrong. At 9 a.m. on May 21st, 1995, Steve Churchill died. In the aftermath, his brain was sent to Edinburgh for analysis. There, they discovered the telltale, tiny sponge-like holes of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. In and of itself, this was not impossible. In the mid-90s, as now, natural CJD killed around 60 Britons a year, but rarely did it attack someone so young. By June, scientists working on the poor dead boy's brain were terrified they might have a new disease on their hands. Their predictions would turn out to be painfully right. That October, 2 teenagers came down with this new form of CJD, then a cattle farmer. Come March 1996, 8 young people had all died of CJD in a matter of months, a near statistical impossibility. On the 8th of the month, the government called a meeting with the nation's top scientists. It was there that a horrifying announcement was made. Despite all the years of assurances, despite John Gummer's massive propaganda drive, BSE had jumped the species barrier. Mad cow disease was now killing humans, eating away at their brains. There was no way to stop the process or reverse it, and no one knew how many people were infected. The next few days played out like a horror movie, as the human form of BSE was declared variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or VCJD. Panicked politicians asked how many people it might kill. The answer was anything from a few hundred to over 500,000. 500,000 Britons killed by a disease that was entirely man-made, a disease that wouldn't exist if the government hadn't stifled scientists and made faulty assumptions. Yet, even as those in Whitehall faced down the barrel of a devastating pandemic, no one bothered to warn the public. No one told people about the dangers of eating beef for another 12 days. Finally, on the morning of March the 20th, 1996, the tabloid The Daily Mirror broke the story in bold text. BSE can kill humans. Just hours later, the Health Secretary stood up before Parliament and declared a new deadly brain disease caused by infected beef had been discovered. By now, there were 10 cases in humans. What happens next, no one knew. They could, however, agree on one thing. It was going to be the scandal of the decade. In the aftermath of the government's announcement, Britain's beef industry collapsed. Billions of pounds were wiped out, alongside millions of cattle. In an effort to control the disease, 4.4 million cows were slaughtered and burned. Incinerators glowed on farms around the clock. Dead cattle piled up in mountains of corpses. Up to 60 farms went bankrupt. Internationally, the EU immediately banned all beef imports from Britain, but it was already too late. Over the following years, 26 French people would die of VCJD, alongside 5 Spaniards, 4 Irish, 3 Dutch, 2 Italians, and 2 Portuguese. But it was in Britain that the human cost would be at its highest. By 1998, there were 18 cases a year, all of them fatal. While that's a relatively small number, it masks awful suffering. Almost all of the victims of VCJD were under 30. Most were teenagers. As the disease took hold, they lost their motor functions, the ability to speak, became badly disabled, unable to do anything but wail in pain as their families looked on, helpless to stop their agony. It was a nasty, painful way to die, one made worse by different approaches across the nation. In some areas, patients were allowed to be with their families. In others, they were locked in isolation for the last months of their lives, left to die alone in agony by local authorities, scared they might pass their sickness on. That same year, the new government set up a research body to basically try and estimate how screwed they were. The answer? Utterly screwed. VCJD was found to not just infect the brain and the spine, it infected the entire body, even getting into the blood. And some of those who had already died of VCJD were known blood donors. Over 6,000 people in Britain were given BSE-infected blood. As the government spent £100 million to filter the disease out of the blood bank, most countries on Earth banned British blood donations, bans that still remain in effect. As the new millennium dawned, it looked like the crisis would never end. The year 2000 saw a jump in annual deaths to 28. The next year, BSE appeared in Japanese cattle, the first country outside Britain to be sucked into the crisis. 2 years after that, in 2003, Canadian cattle were infected. At least one entered the human food chain, leading to a total shutdown of Canadian exports that wiped $11 million off the economy every single day. And then, just as it looked as if the crisis had hit a tipping point, it stopped. Although 2005 saw the first Japanese human death from VCJD, it wouldn't be followed by another. In the UK, the cases were on a downward trend. By 2007, they had dropped to only 5 cases per annum. Although over 160 Britons had died so far, it seems like the threat of death from mad cow disease had at last faded. Or had it? In the mid-1950s, scientists made a gruesome discovery in the highlands of New Guinea. An isolated tribe was being felled by something similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Children, adults, the elderly were all succumbing, first losing their coordination, then feeling their minds slip away as the blight consumed them. Given the rarity of CJD, it would have been remarkable if 2 members of the tribe had died of it, but dozens? Clearly, something was going on. So scientists investigated and uncovered a shocking story. The tribe were cannibals whose death rituals involved eating the bodies of their loved ones. At some point, they'd consumed the brain of someone with CJD, allowing it to infect more tribe members, who'd in turn infected more tribe members when they died of the disease, and so on. It was eerily similar to BSE in Britain, so much so that when the mad cow disease scare kicked off in the 1990s, London sent some people to investigate. They would not return with reassuring news. Just like with VCJD, the New Guinea tribe had exhibited an onset of symptoms some 5 years after eating infected meat. But there hadn't just been a single spate of deaths. There had been at least 2 distinct waves. In some cases, the incubation period had lasted up to 50 years. The proteins that CJD deforms, remember, the ones that turn into toxic chains that eat through your brain, they always carry one of 2 variants, M or V. Since they're inherited from our parents, everyone on Earth has either MM genes in these proteins, or MV or VV. All the New Guinea tribe members to die in the first wave had the MM genotype. Now, nearly half a century later, all those to die from VCJD in Britain and abroad had also been MM types. This left a single horrifying likelihood. BSE was going to return, and it started in late 2014. A 36-year-old British man began showing signs of CJD. When he died in February 2016, scientists checked his brain and discovered he'd been infected with the human form of BSE, likely from eating infected meat as a child. But here's the kicker. When scientists finally checked his genotype, they found he didn't hold an MM combination, but MV. There had been a suspected case before, in 2009, but this was the first confirmed one. Finally, the dormant disease was activating in a whole new slew of people. And with that cliffhanger, our story has to end. Since 2016, there have been no more confirmed deaths of MV gene holders due to VCJD. It may be that this man-made plague is over, that there will be no more deaths, and mad cow disease will soon be seen as a relic of the 1990s, on par with the Spice Girls and maybe Tamagotchis. But that seems unlikely. Everything we know about VCJD suggests there's a second wave right around the corner, a point in the near future when it will cut a swath through Britain's population again, felling those with the VM genotype. In the early 2010s, the UK government reported that as many as 1 in 2,000 Britons may be silent carriers of VCJD, with dozens more scattered across the globe. When the second wave finally hits, it could kill any number of them. To date, 178 people in the UK have died of human variant BSE, with another 52 dead in other countries. In a world shaken by COVID-19, it's tempting to hear such statistics and think, that's not much. But make no mistake, VCJD isn't a regular disease. It's a man-made disaster and a government cover-up, one more comparable to a Soviet bioweapons leak or the Tuskegee syphilis experiment than to a natural phenomenon. Faced with knowledge that could have saved lives if published but resulted in an economic hit, the British government chose to protect the economy. Because of that choice, over 230 people died, with hundreds more possibly to come. Usually when we think of these sorts of cover-ups, we think of incompetent dictatorships or nations in the distant past. But BSE, a disease caused by human greed, shows this isn't always the case. You can live in a rich, Western, functioning democracy and still be killed by government malfeasance. The story of this horrific plague isn't over. There may be another volume still waiting to be written, one that catalogues yet more deaths, yet more appalling, needless suffering. All we can do is just wait and see. So I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it interesting. If you did, please do hit that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Crossout, link to them below. And thank you for watching.